Ecology, chapter 4, it's worth between 15 and 25% of your Leaving Cert. And you can see by looking here, it comes up every single year in section C as a 60-mark question. It does come up in section A as a 20-mark question. It didn't, there you can see in 2019, 2020 and 2024. And we can see sometimes it comes up in section B, the experiments. So let's start off definitions. Okay, ecology, what is it? It's the study of organisms and their environment. Now, before I just bracketed off their interaction because interaction is bracketed off. So you could say ecology is the study of the interaction between organisms and their environment, and it's still correct. Just in the last time this was asked, we just bracketed off interaction. Ecosystem, exact same as ecology, study of organisms and their environment. So if you have the textbook, I said there's a typo there, so just rewrite that and put in there. Biosphere, so parts of the earth where life exists. Then we have habitat, a place where organisms live. Niche, we have the role of the organism. Environment, refers to all conditions and where the organism lives, what affects their growth and development of the organism. Population is all members of the same species living in an area. The word same has to be there, very important. Community is all the organisms found in an ecosystem. So the word all has to be there. Okay, so we're going to look at now the life of an organism is affected by components in the environment, which may include abiotic, biotic, climatic and edaphic factors. The biotic factors we'll look at in a moment, they are living. Okay, so they can ask you what is meant by the term biotic. And what we'll look at competition, predation, parasitism and symbiosis. Of our abiotic factors, these are non-living. So of your abiotic factors, we have aquatic, which would, if you did the study of an ecosystem by the seashore, you'd look at light intensity, current and salinity. Current factors, you'd look at the effects of the weather, so light intensity, air temperature, soil temperature, humidity, day length, rainfall, and that could be with your woodland and your grassland ecosystem. Edaphic means anything related to the soil. So you may look at soil pH, soil particle size, humus and mineral content. And again, you may look at that in a bit more detail when you do study of a grassland or ecosystem. So now we're looking at energy flow in the ecosystem. So all organisms need to live, so typo there if you have the notes. So the sun is the primary source of energy on Earth. So energy flows from one organism to the next. So that would be done on a food chain. So we have here producers. Producers are green plants, so they make their own food, autotrophs. So they make their own food using energy from the sun. Producers are then eaten by primary consumers. Primary consumers are herbivores. They'll only eat green plants. So I've got an example there of a green fly. The primary consumer is then eaten by a secondary consumer. And a secondary consumer are usually omnivores. If you have the book, typo. Fix that up, please. And then secondary consumers will then be eaten by the tertiary consumer. So they're at the top of the food chain. And they're usually carnivores. So what is a food chain? Next definition that we need to know. A food chain is a sequence of the organisms showing transfer of energy from one to the next. Okay, so that is important. And what is important within that definition is the term sequence. Forget the word sequence, we lose our mark. So only about 10% of energy at each trophic level is passed on to the next. So that means we have 90% left over. And that means that there's a large loss of 90%. So energy decreases from one trophic level to the next. Trophic level is feeding level. So this limits the number of trophic levels in a food chain to 4 or 5. You could be asked then to draw a food chain and keep it really, really simple. So with drawing a food chain, I've got one example here. We have dandelion, snail, thrush and sparrowhawk. So my dandelion is my producer, your snail is your primary consumer, which is your herbivore, your thrush is your secondary consumer, your omnivore, and then your sparrowhawk is your carnivore. Now what's very important is when you're drawing a food chain is that you have arrows in between, okay, not a line. The line, you're not showing where the transfer of energy is going. Is it going to the left or is it going to the right? You're not showing. So the arrow shows us that. So it's very important that we do an arrow. And also that your food chain ideally reads left to right going across. So trophic level we mentioned before. So trophic level, another term that you need to know, is the feeding level in a food chain. Now it may be possible for the secondary consumer in the food chain above to be a primary consumer in other food chains because it's an omnivore. So remember, omnivores can be both plants and animals. Now a food web, another term we need to know. A food web is a series of interconnected food chains. So I have here, draw a food web containing 3 chains and 4 trophic levels. So the last time this was asked as well was in 2017 in section B of the paper. They did ask students to draw a food chain. So here's an example of a food chain. Ideally, a food web, Ideally your food web would read from the bottom up. It can also read from left to right going across. It's never going to read from the top to the bottom. So our producers, grass, your green plants. Then I have here for this example your primary consumers. If we just follow one food chain, because remember food web is interconnected food chains. Your grass, green fly, blue tit, eaten by the sparrowhawk. Sparrowhawk, your tertiary consumer, blue tit, your secondary consumer, and the green fly primary. Then we have another food chain going up. We have grass, insect vole, type of very small little field mouse, and sparrowhawk. So here we have our arrows showing the transfer of energy. So linking back up here, just to show you, remind you again that we have here only 10% of the energy is passed on. So here we have 10% of the energy is passed on, 90% is given off, usually as heat. So what's important there is we have our arrows which show the direction of the energy flow. So that's the purpose, very important. In food chains and food webs, we have arrows. This brings us on to pyramid of numbers. And what's a pyramid of numbers? It shows the number of organisms at each trophic level. So each ecological pyramids can be used as a way of comparing different communities of the ecosystems at different trophic levels. That's their purpose. So they usually are restricted as well to 3 or 4 levels. And that's again due to the amount of large energy lost. So we know that 90% of the energy is lost, only 10% is passed on. So here's an example of a normal food chain. Pyramid of numbers, So we have our ash tree. On our ash tree we have our green fly. Eating off the green fly we have our spider, and eating off that would be the blackbird. Okay, so you have your primary consumer, your secondary consumer, and your tertiary consumer. So here's another example. This is the food chain I had earlier on the previous page. We have dandelions, thrush, dandelion snails, thrush, and our sparrowhawk. So we have our producer, our primary consumer, our secondary consumer, and our tertiary consumer. So this then brings us on to an inverted pyramid of numbers. And we know it's inverted because here's a normal pyramid of numbers. And then we have inverted. Okay, so at the top, it's larger than the bottom. Okay, so one example here we have is cowslips, type of plant, eaten by moths. The moths will be eaten by bats. And then on the actual bat would be mites. So there could be thousands or hundreds of mites on a bat. So here's another example. We have a tree. On the tree we have green fly, feeding off the green fly, or ladybirds, and then feeding on the ladybirds. Actually, on them are the parasites. Okay, so this is saying here, note that one producer is supporting thousands of primary consumers. So you have one tree, and that could be supporting thousands of green fly. We just don't know how many. Now, and this brings us on to a limitation of our pyramid of numbers. So again, if you have the textbook, there's a typo there. So it has there, list the limitations of the pyramid of numbers. So the first main thing is it doesn't take into account the size of the organism. So that's speaking there, exactly great example here is of the tree. The tree we know would be the largest organism, but it doesn't take into account the size of the organism. Second point here, it may not be possible to represent large numbers of organisms correctly. So we're just saying here, this green fly, there's thousands of green fly, but we don't know exactly how many. So it's not representing the large number. So you do need to know these limitations, and they could ask you to draw a pyramid of numbers. Or another nice one is they'll give you the pyramid and they'll ask you to label A, B, C, D, parts of D, depending on what it is. So look to see if it's an inverted pyramid numbers or a normal pyramid of numbers. And if it's inverted at the top is larger, that'll be your parasites. Finished.